And hello, folks. Welcome to Totally Tanked, episode 49, I believe. It is Saturday, the 12th of August, 2023. My name is John. I'm joined by
Rob, and we are Totally Tanked, the tankiest podcast in Tankville. Hello, John.
Hello, Rob. And Rob, what are we doing this episode?
We're doing the Panzer. The Panzer.
The Panzer?
The Panther. Panther. The Panzer Kampfwagen 3. That's 5, isn't it? Number 5.
Dry, 6.
Yeah, something like that. Or the SDKFVZ 171, or Panzer Kampfwagen Panther, or just called a Mark 5. And you're right, it's episode 49, so not quite 50 yet, even though I turned 50 the other week. There we go, boys and girls.
We might need to think about doing something for our 50th episode.
We will indeed.
We've got a bunch of folks on the line. Ramo from Finland, who thinks conscripts are fine operating tanks, having been a CV90 driver himself. We'll take your considered thoughts on board there, sir. Tasman's joining us from Sydney. He was counting down the minutes, which is good. View from the Turret has joined us from the USA, and George...
Alexander Hodges, that Nair show is going to miss a little bit of it.
Yes, Alexander's always doing exciting things when we're recording, so again, good luck to him, I say. And George, grumpy old school gun Paleos or something. Anyway, George, welcome from Massachusetts. Good to have you with us. Good to have everyone here. All right, we're going to talk about Panther, and...
First off, we're going to go through our Patreons.
Ooh, yeah, okay. Let's do that.
As we fill up our beer, and I'll talk about which beer we're having in a moment.
Yes, indeed. So, our Artificer level patrons, we've got Chris Pezze, Cornelius Weber, G-Hoke, Pear, and Stamps. And then at our next level tier down, we've got new subscriber James O'Hagan, Anton Gorbanov, Steve Matthews, Vikram Murthy, Floaty Burb, Brian Jenkins, Jay Beckman Strauss, Jamie Stokes, Steve Matthews, Spencer Davis, Fartmaster Corey, Carter Heller, Scotch. And I think we've got everyone. Yes.
Well done.
All right.
And we'll talk about John's merch, the merch for Totally
yes, redbubble.com to get the shirts. They're looking good. We sold an IS2 shirt, which was...
and a tank top.
Very exciting.
An IS2 tank top.
Did we? Oh, okay.
And stickers. Lots of stickers going out recently.
Yeah, okay. We've been asked for more mic volume, so we're turning that up. Okay. Cool.
Tanks. Do we talk about tanks?
Let's do that.
All right. Why was it the Mark 5, boys and girls? Because as we
all the German numbers weren't actually sequential. Panzer 4 came out before the Panzer 3. Tiger came out, the Panzer 6 came out before the Panzer 5.
Yeah. All right, so it's not, the marks aren't actually to do with... and
the Panther marks get even weirder because the Aus D came out before the Aus A.
Yep, so it goes D, A, G, and then an F. But the F didn't really make it, and the Panther 2 would have also been a Mark 5, but it didn't make it to the starting line either. So yes, as John says, it's all to do with the role and weight class that the tank was in, because the Mark 5, the Panther, was not a breakthrough tank. It was a medium tank. It stayed with the Panzer 3, 4, and then 5 designation, even though...
Although Tiger did get a Panzer 6 designation.
Yes, yeah. Which is why, because that's why Panzer 6 for the Tiger was their breakthrough tank. And there was no, even though the Tiger 2 didn't get any of those sort of designations, it was just still classed as a breakthrough tank. So just to clarify why we're calling it that. All right, so I will just quickly talk about our beer tube beer. Yes, no?
Yep. Okay,
all right.
What we got?
We have Überbrau. Basically, all I could find on it was it is an exported German beer. That was pretty much it.
And it's the Oberbier.
Yeah.
You could sing Deutschland über alles with your Überbrau in hand, couldn't you?
Correct. Now, the only things I could find on the internet about this is that it's export German beer, supposedly by the Radeberger Brewery, who also supposedly make Vladimir Putin's favourite beer. So...
What's Vladimir Putin's favourite beer?
Well,
why are we drinking that?
Well, that's all. As I said, I think that's all I could find on the interwebs about it, and I think it's all wiki lies. But yes, it was. They were going. It is German beer. It just means a export German beer. So nobody's actually taking ownership for this beer. That's how bland it is, and all they're saying is we are a good beer. We made by the German purity laws and yada 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 yada.
Look, the German purity laws is making a virtue of necessity, and it was basically simply that the Germans didn't have in the 1516 the means to measure alcohol by volume. So they came up with a system of taxing the beer based on the input ingredients, which is a reasonably sensible approach to take to solving the problem. But it had nothing to do with beer quality. It was just like, you have to use these ingredients so we can tell how much alcohol's in it. Yes.
Yep, it's a 330ml bottle and 4% beer. And look, it's a fine taste. I've got no dramas with it. There's nothing, no harsh tastes or anything like that to it. So yeah.
Look, it's a quaffable lager. It's not exceptional in any. It may as well be in cans sold in 30-can blocks. But that's.
So that's our first of our German beer stays. There might be more later on. All right, so the reason for the Panther. I'm going to say Panzer 5.
Everyone gets it wrong. I've seen the Chieftain mix them up.
Yeah. All right. The idea was to replace the Panzer 3 and the Panzer 4. Design started. The concept started in 1938, but design for the Panther started in 1942 itself. Now it was. One of the remarkable things about this tank is that they came up with the design and then put it in production and started rolling it off the factory line within a year. Now, they reckon no other tank has been able to achieve that. That's why...
There were reasons why it was a bad idea to rush it through like that, though.
We'll get to that. So, but yes, the testing phase might have been better off with a slightly longer testing phase. So that was produced from 1943 to 1945. Surprisingly enough, it didn't actually end in 1945 after the war, because the Brits came along and said, you know what, let's have a look at how they did this and what they like. And
they made one more.
No, they made 9 more.
Oh, did they?
They made 9 Panthers and 12 Jagdpanthers. And there was the Remy guys went into the factory, grabbed up the German workers and said, "Yep, get back to work, you lot. So if you want to be paid this month, we want a few more Panthers out of you." And
the way I've heard it described is there was a production line full of Panthers, and they basically turned the handle, and another one came out the end, and that one went to Bovington, and obviously there was more than just that one. So
the one at Bovington is the one they've ended up with. So it was built by Remy, Remy's under Remy supervision. So that's why they've got that one there, along with the Jagdpanther. And
of course there was the use of we're kind of getting to the end of the story. The French took Panthers to Vietnam, mostly because the French Foreign Legion was staffed up with gentlemen of blonde hair and blue eyes who didn't want to talk about what they'd been doing from 1939 to 1945, but were mysteriously competent in the operation of Panther tanks. So thanks to the Foreign Legion there.
Now, Tasman's saying we're getting a bit of lag. Anybody else doing that? We've also got Ethan, Elston, Alexander, Vlad, and Alan on the line. Thanks for joining us all. All right. 6,000 were built.
Making it the third most produced German fighting vehicle of the war. This is the thing a lot of people, myself included, struggle with, is you think of the Panther as one of the big cats. You think of them
as late war, and it was basically
rare. And the Panther was mass produced and mass deployed and did actually get into the field in huge numbers. I've seen a bunch of numbers on what it cost, but the one that everyone seems to come back to is you could build 4 Panthers for what it would take to build 5 Panzer IVs. And that was an incredibly good deal because it could do so much more than a Panzer IV could.
And almost 3 Panthers for the cost of 1 Tiger. So away you went from there. Because essentially they had streamlined their production lines and ways they were building the tanks at that point. By that point in time in 1943, that they could churn them out for a much lower cost and much faster. All right, weighed 45 tons. It was 22 and a half feet long, 28 with the gun forward, so a long tank, 11 foot 3 inches wide, with a bit extra with the side skirts when they put it on, and 10 feet high. For a medium tank, it was big. All right, just let me. Everyone thinks of the medium tanks of the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. The Panther is big.
It's big. It's not that much heavier than them, but it's big. And we're going to get into reasons why it was so big, which comes into why the design had some real problems. But,
realistically, it was it's easily the biggest medium tank in the war. There was nothing, any other tanks. There was plenty of heavy tanks that were smaller than it.
Yeah, I mean, but it was a late war tank. All tanks were getting big. It was definitely big enough to make it a really terrible urban fighting tank, which is a bit of a problem for how it got used. But yeah.
All right, so I had a crew of 5, standard loader, commander, gunner, and then driver and bow gunner / radio operator. Armor. It had 100 mils of armor on the front, well sloped.
Yep.
Good, and around 40 to 45, 48 mils on the sides.
Let's talk about the side armor, shall we?
But it had good frontal protection. It was basically how they managed to keep the weight of this tank down, whereas the Tiger was much heavier and of a similar volume, being another 10 tons heavier. It was basically, they put all the armor at the front.
Yeah, I mean, Tiger was a breakthrough tank, so it was designed to be taking fire from the sides, and therefore it needed that strong armor. You could make a very valid argument the Panther really was almost more a tank destroyer than a tank. And as a result, it was meant to hide in ambush and,
No, I'm not going to make that argument.
Well, you're not. Particularly where it was used best, where it functioned best, where it achieved was not charging at the enemy. It was picking them off as they came across.
Well, it was a medium tank. It was designed to work with your infantry, whereas your breakthrough tank breaks through the lines and goes by themselves to clear the gap for the infantry and engineers and medium tanks to come in along behind it. And that's what the Panther was designed for. It so happened to be, and that's why it didn't have to have good side protection, because it should have infantry all around it in order to protect it from any attacks from the sides.
Yeah, but it was so weak on the sides that anti-tank rifles could penetrate it, and that's a significant weakness. Also, they stored all the ammunition in the sides. Which meant the penetration was extremely problematic. Then they developed the Scherzen to try and protect the sides, and that's why they realised they didn't need the Panther 2, is because they could just hang some side armour on the sides, and that would stop anti-tank rifles. But I do love that many people who call themselves experts, and they're not all wrong, will say, the anti-tank rifle was a dreadful misstep and it was never useful. But even in 1944, an anti-tank rifle could kill a Panther if you could get a side shot at it. So, and in terms of just having a socking big anti-material rifle on the battlefield, if, two guys can carry it and its ammunition, it still has merit, is what I'm saying there.
The gun. Well, here we go. The gun was the big thing of this tank, which is the 75 mil KWK 42 L70, and they carried 79 rounds. Basically,
it's a beautiful gun.
Yep. The main thing with this gun is because they have fired a very big round with lots of extra propellant behind it.
Huge muzzle velocity. Yep.
Huge and a long barrel, and so it was very fast muzzle velocity. Meant that as soon as it left, the trajectory of the round was very flat, which made it highly accurate out to 1,000 meters. So what they could see and point the barrel at, it was going to hit. There was no arcing, there was no lobbing. It was just going to go from here to there in a straight line. And so,
yeah, they talk about an effective range of 2 kilometers, and every time people start talking about ranges of 2 kilometers, I say, as a fun little exercise, get a long straight of road, drop a friend off, drive 2 kilometers, turn around and see if you can see a friend, because you can't see a lot at 2 kilometers. It's
that's what you have binoculars for.
Yeah, I mean the slide only had a 5 times magnification, which okay, it's 5 times, but it's you really want heading up into the 100 times magnification to see things well at 2 kilometers distance.
But we all know that German optics were very good for that sort of stuff, John.
It's also even with huge telephoto lenses, you've got atmospheric diffraction, and you're still not going to see very well over those huge distances. And if you are zoomed in enough to see, you can't see anything but the tiny patch of ground you're looking at. And Panther had an incredibly terrible turret traverse. But
again, all these things were bad to begin with. They improved them. All right, 2 MG34s, one in the bow for the bow gunner, one in the and what's the word I'm looking for? Always forget this one. In the turret. What's the coax version? Yeah. They had 5,100 rounds. 7 gears forward, 1 reverse. They had the Maybach petrol V12 690 horsepower engine. Everybody says that they kept on going and going until it broke down. It could carry 730 litres of fuel, which only get it 260 k's on road or 100 k's off road. So, wow, that's great fuel efficiency for a country that's very low on fuel.
Yes. Yeah. I did. It's worth noting that they, instead of going for gigantism, which obviously the Russians were heading to with their 122mm gun, they were saying, let's get a really good gun, and we don't care if it's got the big headline number on the bore diameter. They're saying, let's just get a really good gun. And I mean, it was probably too long in that it caused them enormous troubles in close quarters fighting. But boy, they really got a great cannon onto this thing, and it was an absolute terror. Yeah.
All right. It had a on-road speed of 55 k's an hour for the first versions, and then they had to govern that down to 46 k's an hour because it was they were burning out the engines and the transmissions and everything else. So they said, yeah, if we just rein that back a bit, we might actually be able to keep it in the field for a bit longer. Now, little song for us. The wheels on the Panther go round and round. How many wheels do we have? How many wheels do we have, John?
Was it 10 or 12 aside?
18.
Aside?
18 aside.
Yeah, right.
18 aside of road wheels and drive wheels and everything else. So 36 wheels. Yes, it made for a very smooth ride, but that's a lot of wheels to maintain.
It's a lot of wheels to maintain. It gets worse than that because it was torsion bar suspension, so it's 32 torsion bars running through the tank because torsion bar is two bars. Sorry, and I don't think they shared them along an axle, so it's double that. Anyway, part of the reason why Panther ended up being so enormously flipping high was because it had all these torsion bars going through the bottom of the hull, and there was no room for anything else down there, so everything else had to pack on top of that. And there was the Daimler-Benz version of Panther, which used external bogie-based suspension, similar to what the Americans were using and the British would use into the pretty much up until Challenger. Yes, it's not as smooth a ride as all these multi-road wheels, but it's a lot easier to maintain. It doesn't take up as much internal volume of the tank. And if anything breaks, it's on the outside of the tank, whereas when there's damage to a torsion bar, they're ending up having to cut the bars out with an oxyacetylene torch. Compared to a damaged wheel bogie, which you just unbolt the bogie and bolt a new one on, and away you go. And there are horrific scenes of an interleaved road wheel, if an interior one gets damaged, God help you, having to take off 5 wheels to get to the wheel you actually you need to deal with. Yeah. So I think the verdict of history is that the interleaved road wheels weren't worth the costs they brought. Particularly, they all needed rubber linings on them, and Lord knows what Germany didn't know where it was getting its next rubber shipment from.
Now, it's called Schachteler Off-Work Design. Now, I'm totally butchering that pronunciation because my German is horrible, but yes, that's what it's called. So, 18 18 wheels on each side. A lot of the design-wise, a lot of the ideas were put into the Panther, but then had to be put aside due to other considerations like the rear drivetrain, diesel engines, the turret shape, the bogies, because essentially they already had production lines for all the bits and pieces that went into the Panther. So they said, right, while we'd like to go this other design with rear drivetrains, diesel engines, different wheels and so forth, and the turret shapes, we've already got these bits already in production, so we're just going to continue with that. And that's why they were able to continue with build such big numbers of them in a short amount of time, is because their production lines were already set, even though it was still a great tank for what they managed to get out. But if they whether or not they could have built something better with if they'd had more time and energy. And they're also missing a number of they were short on machine tools to be able to build the machines that to build these new designs. So As I said before, it's a lot cheaper and quicker to build than Tiger 1s due to improvements to production, learned from the Tiger, but still very over-engineered. Yes, over-engineering.
Over-engineered is a funny word. People keep using it about Germans. I'm not at all convinced that over-engineering is as much of a thing as simply poor design.
Well, I think by being so good at it, basically the only right way you get such a good overall outcome is by over-engineering, by putting all the bells and whistles on it, which I remember the chieftain saying Germany had to be building tanks like this because there's no way they could compete for the numbers that the Russians and the US were putting out of the T-34s and the Shermans. They had to build something that was so much better in such limited, even though they had more limited numbers, they had to be so much better that they would to be able to compete in the battlefield.
Look, I hear what you're saying. I would. We talked about this when we did the Tiger episode, in that they really had no option at all except to build super tanks. They needed a single tank that was 4 times better than their opponents, because they didn't have the fuel and they didn't have the crews and they didn't have the steel to build lots of cheap tanks. And you can look at what the Russians did with T-34, and you know, we've called this before the crap tank fallacy, where you build lots of crap tanks but you lose them all and you lose the crews, and you can't build expertise. So they were onto the right idea with building better tanks, but I would just question whether they actually built that with this tank. A big example would be the complexity of the hatches, which you can call over-engineering, but I would call poor design. And the problem with the hatches was that they were so complex and slow that the crews went into battle with the hatches open. You know, we got all these pictures for those on the live stream of the and the hatches are always open, and even when they went into full combat, the hatches were open because they did not trust the ability to get the damn things open to get out of the tank if they got hit, particularly with all the ammunition stored in the side sponsons. So you've taken away an enormous amount of protection from the tank by having a design that the crews refuse to use in the way that you think it should be used. And this sort of comes down to why you need longer than a single year to design a fighting vehicle, so that real soldiers can take it out and take it around and go, oh, hang on, this is going to be a problem for us.
Let's get to, so rolling off the production line, the first ones came out in January and February of 1943, handed over to the 51st and 52nd Tank Battalions. They had such problems with these tanks as they rolled off the production line that they immediately went back into the shop in April and May to get fixed up, and these are still the version Ds, the Alf's D, and so that even then, once they went back into the shop for April and May, they still came off the railway cars to the Battle of Kursk in June, July 1943, and 2 of them promptly caught fire.
Yeah,
just getting off the train.
Yeah,
and you got to love that for a they rolled it out as quick as they could, got it in production, rolled it out to the troops. Had to pull it back to say, okay, we've got a few things we need to work on here. And even then, after another 2 months of trying to overhaul the tanks and make them better, of the 200 delivered for the Kursk, Battle of Kursk, 2 of them caught fire as they were getting off the train. So not the best thing you want to do for it. And look, it had a number of mechanical issues to begin with. Like, these were huge mechanical issues. Like, the final drive was the big one. Basically, the original design for the tank was for 35 tons. We actually started out as 20, then 30, then 35, and they ended up building a 45-ton tank. So again, like all the other tanks, it was a case of we built the specifications for one value of weight, and then we've made it almost twice as heavy at some stages. And the components within the tank just aren't rated for those sort of weights, and so they would strip the final drive, they would strip the transmission, the engine would burn out. All of these sort of things would happen, especially at the beginning of the tank. And basically, they had far more casualties to maintenance failures, to the tanks breaking down, than they did to enemy fire, essentially.
Yeah, and you've just got things in the design. I mean, it's been described hyperbolically. We'll get to hyperbole in tank YouTubing soon. Not soon, probably in an hour's time. But hyperbolically it's been described as a final drive made of cut crystal and wet cardboard, and there's definitely some merit to that. Although, as we'll discuss in the later marks, a lot of these issues were improved, and in the later marks, its reliability was not dramatically worse than other vehicles. For example, they could at least get the final drive out of the tank without having to pull the turret, which was a improvement over our Tiger friend. But, the fact that the tanks tended to leak a lot of petrol, the fact it was a huge petrol engine driving a huge tank, the engine compartment would fill up with fumes and just wait to catch fire. Then it's got neutral steering in it, but if you used it, you would almost certainly destroy the final drive, in which case the smart thing to do would not to be enable a feature that would lead to the destruction of the vehicle. Also, crazy stuff. The amount of load it put on the driver, where to make a turn in the distance, he needed to be selecting the correct gears for the turn radius in those gears on each set of tracks, is just problematic compared to better tank designs of the period, where you just turned a wheel and the machinery took care of the gearing and where the wheels had to go, and that meant you could invest crew training into other things other than just the mechanics of desperately trying to make this very complicated machine go around. And then we come back to Germany just running out of good quality tank crews by the late war because they had all been killed. And this starts to become really problematic for our I wouldn't say German friends. I'm glad they lost, but they were making some really poor choices with the design, largely because they didn't have a lot of options, and they were prioritizing simplicity of construction over simplicity of operation, I guess.
However, with all that said, basically the first tanks off the production line were rubbish and broke down a lot. By late 1944, which point you're really on the back foot. However, they had made major improvements. The Alfs A and Alfs G were rolling out, and they had made, some words were a most satisfactory tank and close to ideal. A bit of a high profile. Tanks.
They're the tallest. It's tall.
I reckon the Lee would probably be taller. All up.
Not a good design, though.
with the turrets on turrets on turrets.
Yeah. If you're talking about the American versions with the extra machine gun cupola, then that's a really tall tank. That's also a really bad tank design.
Yeah.
So the fact that an even worse tank design is slightly taller does not a good design make. I've seen them in museums and not realised how tall they are. It was seeing the one they had at Oz Armour Fest going around. It was saying like, "Ooh,"
standing beside that and saying, "This is this is as big as a Tiger." There's no doubts about it. It's like, however, by May 44, the reliability of the Panther was the equivalent of the Panzer IV. So, in Guderian's words, it was damned by faint praise because it had taken that long to get it to where it should be a 6-year-old tank by that stage.
This is the problem with rushing any design to the front. This is one of the reasons why Leslie McNair, for the Americans, was like, no, I don't want a new tank on the front. Because if you take it there too early, you can be like, yes, we get to test all the features and it'll be great getting real world testing. But if the troops are dealing with faulty gear and they start, word gets around that this thing's a dog and it's faulty and it'll kill you, it'll never get used properly even if you rectify the faults. You've got to get these things sorted out in advance.
Sure which way to go with this one. So we'll talk about... now, I'm going to set forward my theory that the Panther lost Germany the war. I'm saying it was the best tank of the war, and it also lost them the war. How's that for an idea? How's that for a proposition, John? And here is my defense of it. So,
okay.
The Battle of Kursk, basically the biggest
Operation Citadel,
the biggest tank battle of the war. It was salient, was a bulge in the German defences that they thought, like, we're going to cut off the Red Army on the Eastern Front here around Kursk. and basically knock that and start pushing them back. Yes, it wasn't the biggest battle because there was not as many divisions involved, but it was the biggest tank battle.
And a huge battle. Yeah, it would easily be in the top 10 of largest battles ever fought.
Yeah.
And I believe still would be, if you take all the constituent bits of it, the biggest tank battle in history.
Yeah, I mean, it's millions of people involved in this thing. But they were in position in April and May of 1943. Hitler decided he's going to wait until his super weapon Panthers got there, and so the battle was delayed and delayed and delayed until July 1943. And in that time, what did the Russians do, John?
What did the Russians do? Anytime you give them months and foreknowledge that you're going to attack, they laid a ton of minefields, they laid a ton of tank traps, they brought up an enormous amount of artillery, and they said, all right, Sonny, come on if you're hard enough.
Yeah, and they also did a lot of training is the big thing. So where previously, when the tanks rolled over the trenches, or tanks rolled into the infantry areas, the troops would go running off or surrender or just give up. This time they had the Russians had training for their troops, whereby say you stay in your trenches, and they would roll their own tanks over the top of those trenches and say, this is the experience you're going to have. This is what you're training for. You let those tanks roll over the top of you. You shoot them in the behind and take them out, and all their supporting infantry, and that's how you take them on. And they did that for 3 months. Hitler gave them 3 months to prepare, to build defences. And what did he get out of that 3 months? He got 200 Panzers.
You got 10 working ones by the time they actually got to the
line. Yeah, it was. After 5 days, they had 10 left. Yeah. So they, of the 200 that were delivered, 2 caught on fire. 54 on the first day broke down before they made it to the starting line. Another 10, I think, got destroyed by the enemy. And after 5 or 6 days, they had 10 left in combat. So yes, they were very good at doing their job when they were in combat, but that 3 month delay is what I'm going to say is has cost them. And they lost the Battle of Kursk is the only thing, John. They lost. They did not succeed in what they were trying to do. Now,
yeah, and furthermore, Germany would never again make a substantial. Well, they continuously lost ground on the Eastern Front from there, and there was one major counteroffensive on the Western Front when that opened. But this was the failure at Kursk. Was pretty much the end of any serious German hope of winning the Second World War, which is no small thing. To the extent we can blame Panther, it's an interesting one, and
this is all my conjecture, right? So this is my speculation. After a number of beers, I'm going to make this speculation. I'm not going to die on this hill, but I am going to put it out there for people to discuss, and saying that. Because of that waiting and the chance for the Russians to build their defences, and the Germans had 2,500 other tanks. So adding these 200, yes, it was probably a combat multiplier for the small number that actually made it there, but they still had 2,500 other tanks at Kursk.
Yeah, the question is, if they had gone earlier and the Russians hadn't had as much time to build the defences, and the Germans had gone with the tanks they'd had 3 months earlier, how differently would the battle have gone? And the answer is probably, that would have been a lot better for them. But they didn't. Obviously, they were hoping that Panther was going to be awesome and ready to roll, and it was all going to be great.
And I also say that there was always the possibility of a separate peace with Russia, and so I'm going to speculate again that if the Nazis had won the Battle of Kursk earlier, then they might have approached Stalin to say, hey, do you want to just call it quits here for a little bit, and we'll just both step back and we'll go mind our own business over here in the West, and you just sort yourselves out. And there was definitely talks of that being a possibility, and there was nobody wanting to discount it, and least of all Stalin himself, because he saw that it was a great idea for being able to hang over the heads of the Western allies, so the US and UK, by saying, well, if you don't keep providing me this Lend-Lease stuff you're doing, then maybe I'll just pull out of the war like we did back in 1917. So how do you feel about that? And basically, being a person is quite willing to use power as realpolitik of saying, I'm going to get what I want to meet my ends, no matter what it costs. Who it costs or how it costs, I don't care. I'm going to get it.
Yeah, it might surprise people to learn Stalin didn't love the Western Allies just for being godless capitalists.
Look, he sold the idea of saying, look, we're the ones fighting this war. You're not even in Europe at this stage. Because they hadn't invaded Sicily.
Oh, Rob, Britain's part of Europe.
not anymore. It's not. So basically saying they're the only ones fighting this war. So why should they care if they make a peace with the Nazis if they can? So I mean, there was a real politicking going on. So it was a possibility if the Nazis had gone 3 months earlier that they could have achieved that and then been able to turn around and smash. The other big thing with Kursk was by having it so late and losing, they also lost a great many of their experienced tank crews. They used a lot of material and spares and everything else that if they'd won, probably wouldn't have used as many. They would have had more of their tank crews available for them later on in the war, and they wouldn't have used as many spare parts and maintenance type activities. So and not having those experienced crews and the fuel and the spare parts and everything else then was detrimental to them when the Panthers were facing the Normandy invasion and the Allies landing and D-Day, because they had inexperienced crews in France driving around the Panthers and made them vulnerable to the tanks that were coming ashore from the US and UK and Canadians and so forth.
Yeah, I actually think people underestimate the losses the Germans took during Barbarossa. The million men they lost in the first 6 weeks of Barbarossa were the absolute best of the German army with the greatest amount of experience that they just never recovered from. And it's funny because, yes, they inflicted 6 million casualties on the Russians. They took an enormous amount of ground.
Getting back to my real politic for Stalin is saying, well, he's quite happy to lose 6 million if he wins the war.
Happens probably the wrong way.
Probably happens the wrong way. He's willing to spend.
Yeah.
He's willing to spend to win. Is what I was getting at.
Killing those million Germans, literally determined the course of the rest of the war. But let's get back to Panther.
So I was saying, well, having seen Panthers in action in Italy and hearing about them from the Russians, coming up to D-Day, the US and the UK said, "Oh, we've heard about these wonder tanks, and what are these Mark Vs? Do we think we need to do anything in order to be able to counter them with our Comets and Shermans?" And the US said, "You know what? No. M4 Sherman with the 75mm gun, she'll be fine." Right, not a thing to worry about.
The 76 underway at this point.
They had it underway, but it was still 2 months away. Yeah. They'd actually approved it for use 8 months beforehand, but they had not deployed it. Right? Again, this is getting back to you, McNair saying, saying, I don't want to mess up the logistics of the situation. However, when the US did get there, they found the M4 Sherman with the 75mm gun couldn't penetrate do anything to the front of the Panther. And the Brits, on the other hand, took the idea of, they saw what was happening and said, hang on a second, we really don't want to go into a battle again where we cannot affect the enemy. We want to be able to at least engage and have some sort of chance of winning.
Which is where your Sherman Firefly comes into it.
Which is why they built the Sherman Firefly. They tried to get the US to say, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea if you put 17-pounders in all the Shermans coming across to us? And again, the US said, no, we're not doing that. So they built this Sherman Firefly. They had 1 in 4 of those in a tank platoon.
Well, I've got to say, it's portrayed as if 1 in 4 was some sort of problem. I actually think that in terms of a functional tank platoon on the Western Front,
that's fine.
It was about right.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've got absolutely no dramas.
It was such a miserably bad tank in anything other than trying to pierce the front blasts of a Panther. That it was literally called Firefly because it blinded the crew when it fired, and there was no room in the turret. And having said that, the Germans quickly tried to knock the Firefly out first, and that's where you get the paint jobs where they try and hide the how long the barrel is.
And look, they had some. They also built their Comets with bigger guns. Again, these all after the D-Day landings in June 44, they helped, but they still meant that they weren't as effective against the Panthers as they possibly could have been if they'd had better guns and better ammunition. And it was, as I was saying, another 2 months before the 76mm gun Sherman started turning up with, and the HVAP ammunition, which would go through the fronts of the Panthers quite happily from much better distances, whereas before and the Shermans had to get around the sides, and if they didn't have the options of manoeuvrability to get around the sides of the German positions, especially when they're on the defensive, then it's much harder for them.
Yeah.
And look, your artillery, your close air support, yes, they did amazing things, and they took out a lot of these tanks, basically halved whatever battlefields they were going into. They pretty much halved the German tanks they were facing, but it still wasn't enough for the superiority of the numbers that were in there. And a lot of tank crews died because of decisions made of saying, no, we don't need the 76, we don't need the 17 pounder, we don't need the HVAP, we're just going to go in with the 75mm gun, and they just bladdered away at the front of the Panthers from the Shermans and could not hurt them.
There was an issue that the classic shot trap scenario. Shot traps are often overstated, but in this case, a hit on the mantlet of the Panther would deflect it into the painfully thin top armor, and
over the driver's hatch.
And it wasn't that you were deflecting into the tank.
Then they built the chin, John.
The chin wasn't demonstrated to actually be effective, but they did put a chin on the later models to stop the shot trap.
With the roundness of the mantlet, so the gun mantlet, any shots hitting the bottom half of the mantlet would be deflected down into the top of the driver's and bow gunner's hatch. So they put a little chin at the front of the curved mantlet, so that those shots would then be deflected back and away from the top of the tank where the thin armor was. So
yeah, it's as someone who's done a little bit of HEMA fighting, you notice that on breastplates in medieval armor, like knights we're talking now, there'd be a little V-shaped piece.
Gorget?
No, the gorget is slightly different, but just a V-shaped piece on the breastplate, and the reason that was there is that it was quite easy for a thrust at the chest
or an arrow
to bounce up off the breastplate and into the throat, and that's bad. They put this,
bad for who?
it's bad for the person in the armor. So the person in the V-shaped, that little V-shaped bit on breastplates just stopped things glancing up and into the throat. And the bit they added to the Panther mantlet was a very similar piece of armor thinking. I just want to quickly note that the AUSFs are not as cut and dried as people would like them to be.
No.
The AUSF D, they changed the turret for the AUSF A, but they kept the rest of the chassis for the start of the production run of the AUSF A, and then partway through that they jiggered around with the machine guns and the drivers things. But it was in the middle of the AUSF A run they made those changes, so it's not definitive if it looks like this at the front. It's A or G. Or
yeah, you can make it's a mix and match grab bag of what parts it came with. Even AUSF Gs at the end of the war were still getting the AUSF D cupolas put upon them if they didn't have anything else. It was very well suited to the Eastern European steppes.
Long ranges.
However, the bocage and the towns and city fighting of France and Normandy was not as good, just because it was too long, especially with the barrel. It was too wide and it was too heavy. So little bridges, little towns, and it would could not maneuver as well through the bocage and so forth.
However, the turret's so freaking long, and the nature of bridges in medieval towns that were built in the medieval era is that they're right in the middle of the town, because the town's built up around the bridge, and it's not helpful.
What have the Romans ever done for us, eh?
Well,
they built most of those bridges through France, didn't they?
At least those were the straight ones, you know. It's the ones where they wiggle around before they get to the bridge that really caused the Panther was built to fight on the Eastern Front. The Panther Yes, the Panther development started before the T-34 was known, but the final Panther, as developed, was entirely a response to T-34.
Yeah, saying we got to be able to do something like this because our 3s and 4s are not able to do anything.
And just look at it. It's got a different turret, but it's got a lot of similarities to T-34 in its hull design.
So it was also not good through forest because the same thing. Basically, couldn't maneuver the barrel around between trees. So when they went through the Battle of the Bulge with the Ardennes, again, it was one of those things of not being able to get through. It was good through mud though, and that because it's of its ground pressure, where it could
wide tracks,
very wide tracks, 66
lots of road wheels,
66.
Look at all the road wheels.
66 centimeter tracks, I think it was. So it could definitely go through snow and mud quite well, whereas other tanks, even the Panzer 3s and 4s would sink, the Shermans would sink, everything else would sink into the mud. It was able to keep going through that. So
there is an issue, and it's a good problem to have, but when tanks get really good at floating over the soft ground, the issue becomes that the troops can, the crew can jump out of the tank and sink in up to their knees, and that's not nice, but it's better than your tank sinking. So huzzah, I guess. Worth noting, this was the same engine as used in Tiger, but a significantly lighter tank. So that unlike most German late war tanks, lack of engine power wasn't actually a problem for it. It was the horrible, terrible German spur cut gears that were the real problem that required super advanced driver training to not trash the tank.
Which you didn't have when the tank
crews did.
Yeah, the tank crews for fighting in France had basically 2 weeks of training with limited fuel to deal with the situation, and suddenly you're not getting the best out of your Panther. You don't have the experience, you don't have the coordination, and you can't. I mean, it was a good tank. I mean, could stop pretty much all for those first 2 months of June, July of 1944. You could stop all the shots from the front. There was no damage. There were no worries there, but they still couldn't make the most of the gun or the tank because of the lack of trained crews. And I still say it's all the Panther's fault.
All the Panther's fault. It comes back to the Allies were miles ahead. Instead of taking the good crews and hailing them as tank aces and flogging them at the front till they died. They took their aces and took them out of the front line once they got to 20 or 25 kills and sent them to training because these guys know what they're doing and they are more useful training the next generation than they are flying or fighting until they go.
They also had that option because they had other people coming in, whereas the Germans did not because they needed everybody at the front.
Yeah, you kind of lost the war already.
They had. All right.
Panther terms.
Panther terms?
Yeah, let's talk about Panther terms.
Tell me which.
The Panther term was where they took a Panther turret.
Oh, yes.
They built a fortification.
Yes.
Now to look at
buried in the street. Yes.
To look at it, just looks like a Panther turret sitting on the street. They were actually very big fortifications underground.
They just buried the tank because what it was is
they did not bury the tank.
Sometimes
they did. The bigger problem was they were producing Panther turrets faster than they could produce Maybach engines to power them. All gone, mate. Yeah.
Sorry. We have more. Don't worry, boys and girls.
More beer. It's okay.
All right. I'm a logistician. I know how to do beer.
So the Panther terms, they had more Panther turrets than they could produce engines to drive them. And, oil becoming a problem as well. So there was a thing, what are we going to do with all these turrets that are exceeding in production and consuming a lot of ball bearings? Ball bearings in the last days of the Reich were a real problem. And the solution was they used them as fortifications. And while it looks like just a Panther turret on the top when you see the photos, they were actually quite large complexes underneath. There was enough room for the crew to sleep.
Yeah, so those are the ones that were built into like the Siegfried line,
the Gothic line,
the Hitler line,
the best of all the lines.
Comic Sans would have something to say about that. All right. So these are part of the fortifications on the Western Front for Germany, whereas the other ones, for the defense of Berlin, similar situation. They had the turrets and the hulls of the Panthers, but they didn't have all the other bits and pieces. And so rather than putting to waste, not using the tanks because they couldn't move them around or anything, they would dig a hole in the streets of Berlin, drag a whole Panther into that hole, and then cover it up. And then that would be your Panther term in the streets of Berlin. That's where some of the photos we've got are. So they're not just part of the fortification lines of, as I said, the Gothic line and everything else. Is basically they've just put these tanks in the middle of the street, and that was the part of the defense of Berlin. And so, yes, you were a tank crew inside. You were part of the street, and you were working with Panther from there. They would put extra armor on the roof of the turret because otherwise they'd just get blown up by artillery. But essentially, and they were very effective as
pillboxes.
Yeah, they were very effective pillboxes because it was hard to take them out because their armor was so good from the front. Which is, if you're coming down a street, there's only you can't flank them effectively because you can only come down this nice long avenue or whatever else in the streets of Berlin, and looking at a very small, low target. It's very hard to hit. So yes, that was part of it, which is totally different from the basement Panther.
Yes.
We got it. I got it. We got it.
Yes, sure. Basement Panther. I mean, it was only 2 or 3 years ago we were doing this podcast when it happened. But
well, they said it was. I thought it was 2015.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it was. So yes, a fellow in. I want to say. Hang on. Was it Germany or Denmark?
It's Germany.
It was Germany. All right.
Yes.
So it was there. Yeah, it was Bundeswehr just came along and picked it up. Had a. He'd been picked up for some other trade in illegal weapons or something else. The police had gone in and they found a fully made Panther in the basement of his mansion.
Yeah.
He had a number of other
German military, shall we say?
Now, the thing is, everyone once it's come out, it's been a big thing. But supposedly he used to drive it around the town, and everybody in town knew all about it. It was only when the police got involved.
It's often the way. There's lots of things people in the town know about that, it becomes an issue.
Yeah, it was only when the police got involved that it became a thing, and that oh my God, somebody's got a Panther in their basement. And yes, the Bundeswehr have come along and picked it up, and now it's all in legal disputes as to who gets this tank and where's it going. So that's all still happening as we speak.
Look, as your country collapses, a lot of looting takes place, and it takes place in different forms, and one of them is, I'll just have that tank.
Now, let's talk about the users. So,
Okay.
Number one user, the Nazis.
Yes.
All right. There were others. Hungary.
Actually, have we got a breakdown of the SS versus the...
No, I did not bother with that.
Yeah.
I'm just going to put. They're all lumped in with the
They're all
Nazis.
Germans.
They're all Nazis, John. Don't care whatever it says. They're all part of it. They may or may not have been. There's the Hungary got 5 in July of 44, and another.
Gee, that would have been great.
Here you go. And another 12 in November of 44. Those 12 were supposedly going to Romania, who had just switched sides, and so Hitler said, "No, I'm not going to give them these to Romania.
It's all the same place.
Yeah. So he gave Romania's to Hungary. Bulgaria got 15 from the Soviets in April of 45. Romania got 13 from the Soviets in 1946. Japan bought.
Oh, hang on, you've forgotten an important user of the Panther.
I haven't.
The Warsaw Uprising.
No, I'm getting to that. I was going to give you a chance to talk about that afterwards. All right, so I've skipped that one so that we can get back talk about it in length. So Japan bought one. But never got delivered.
How was it planning to deliver that?
Japan bought a number of tanks, like individual tanks, and they wanted the Panzer III actually. But they bought one Panther, but it was never delivered just because by that stage of 1943, I think it was, obviously it was 1943 because that's when they're being produced from, there was no way to get shipping from Germany to Japan.
Yeah, I really shudder to try and envisage
and you can't fit a Panther in a submarine.
Aside from using submarines, how you get anything from wartime Germany to Japan without any possibility of success?
Before 1943, they did have some latitude on the seas, but after that, they did not. Sweden,
you've got to.
So it was going to have a lot of improvements based upon the. No, hang on, it's the Panther 2. So I was thinking of, anyway. So it was there, which is now in the U.S. Army Museum.
Yes.
And they've thrown a G turret on top of it. So they've got the Jagd Panther with the 88 gun in it. It's the tank destroyer. 413 of those are made. Again, very effective. Great big gun, and lots of armor at the front. It was a highly effective tank. The Befehlspanzer.
So I just want to say for the folks on the live stream, we just had a bit of a disconnection. It's come back. It was looking really good for a second, and now it's back where we were. So, sorry. We'll fix this next time. Anyway, sorry, Rob, go on.
Yep. So the Befehlspanzer, which is the command tank, don't have numbers on how many that were. They just had lots of more radios in the back type thing. The Beobachtung Panzer. It was the artillery observation tank with the dummy gun. And again, probably more radios. The Berg Panther. There's the armoured recovery vehicle. There's 339 of those made. So some were made with winches so they could drag things out of the mud and so forth. And some were just a turretless tank. And so they were used as a tugboat, really, because they figured out they were good enough, that they were big enough and good enough to drag Panthers and Tigers out of the mud. I don't know how they went with Tiger 2s, but...
Tiger 2s were kind of stuffed, weren't they?
Yep. At 70 tons, I don't think anything was doing around. And then they had the concept for their Flak Panzer Kolien with twin 3.7 centimeter flak guns. However, they did a mock-up for those, but abandoned production as they were not effective enough for taking out Allied bombing at that stage or protecting the tanks, as it were. Then there was the Panther 2. So we talked a little bit about the Panther 2.
Which they just decided they didn't need.
So part of the design function of the Panther 2 is that design started in January of 1943, just as the original Panthers were rolling off the production line. So as before it was even deployed, they started design saying, look, we've got to build a better version of this. It had an increased armour, standardised parts with the Tiger 2, new turret, possibly even they was going to look at the Schmalturm turret, which is the narrow mantlet, narrow turret. So basically, it was whereas you've got the width of the Panther turret at the moment. Basically, they were going to make that smaller by about a quarter and put more armour on the front of it, and being overall lower weight. So the Panther 2 actually had a lot of design features in it. There was going to be huge improvements. It had a greater weight of 50 tons.
But what they didn't need was a better tank at this point. They
just needed more.
They needed more of this tank. And possibly to be fighting in better positions and all the rest of that. But I mean, I will once again say I'm going to cry no tears for Nazis. The internal contradictions of the German fascist project were just piling up at this point, and that's part of why they lost.
Yeah, it was only going to be 50 tons. It was smaller. a smaller engine, but more powerful. So 1/3 the original.
Oh yeah,
So 38%.
The good old more powerful, smaller engine, along with the lighter weight, high velocity gun.
Yeah. So it was going to be 38% of the original engine weight, and giving 200 more horsepower. However, the design was cancelled in May of 43, so 4 months after it started. Before Panther 1 was deployed into the field properly. And only one prototype hull made for the Panther 2. And yes, part of it was they looked at the Panther and said, yeah, there's vulnerability on the sides above the road wheels, all 18 of them, and below the hull. And so they, rather than putting extra armour on there, they put on the Scherzen, and they said, yeah, that'll do. 5 mils of armour there will stop a anti-tank rifle round from going through it, and away you go. I think that's all I've got for the Panther. Have you got anything else you'd like to throw in there, John, or before we go to our
interview?
Our interview.
Yeah. Look, I just want to thank everyone who's persisted with this very glitchy cast. We will examine what's gone wrong here. We're probably not going to leave this up on YouTube afterwards, so the podcast will be how to catch things, and we will smooth over all the problems in that. I think the thing with Panther is they did an astonishing job of building quite possibly the most advanced tank of the Second World War.
I mean, I'm still going to say it was the best tank, but it's still lost in the war. It is my declaration on this.
Yeah.
After however many beers, even though if I didn't get the really strong one.
No, but you thought of that when you were sober. But an incredible tank that they could make incredibly cheaply. The design team did an enormous amount of very good work. Germans just didn't have access to helical cut gears. It's one of those things that you look at guns and engines and horsepower, but the fact that the Americans had helical cut gearing in the drivetrains of their tanks, which are incredibly strong and durable and will drive for 100,000 kilometers without much intervention, versus the spur cut gears that the Germans had, which just break off, and as your metallurgy gets worse as the war goes on, they break more. And let's not forget, because the Germans in World War II were fundamentally evil.
Oh, and using slave labour to build their tanks.
Bingo, that's where I'm getting. Your slaves are not motivated workers.
Quality control goes out the window.
Look, there's a German ME-109 in the Australian War Memorial here in Canberra. And one of the things they discovered when they started refurbishing it was that the interior...
All the graffiti.
...was full of gypsy curses against the pilots. So that the people building it did not love...
shipped into Australia saying, yes, it's a Mustang. And then when they opened up the shipping container, somebody said, hang on a second, that's not a Mustang, that's an ME-109.
Yeah. And we will talk about big things in store at the Australian War Memorial in the second half. Because I believe that one's in there right now. But
well, and not it's intro. I've seen it in Trelaw, and anyway,
it had been in Anzac Hall, but I think with the renovations,
we'll talk about that after the interview.
So cool. So that's Tasman. I'm sorry we don't know Barkman's Corner, so we apologise for that. But thank you for hanging with us through this choppy video, and we are now going to go to an interview with Peter Samsonov of the Tank Archives, which we thought was quite an interesting one.
Even if a bit too early for us on a Sunday morning.
If you are wondering, I am wearing eyeshadow because I'd been at a party the night before dressed in costume.
I think neither one of us are terribly great on a Sunday morning.
I had thought maybe this is the first tank-related social media with someone wearing eyeshadow, and then went to Sophie line.
Yeah.
She wears eyeshadow all the time. She's totally beaten me to
Hey, I'm not wearing
I can see you're not wearing it.
Not now.
Yeah. Anyway, we're going to the video now, and we will be back with lots more to talk about in the second half of the show. So thank you, folks, for sticking with us, and here we go. Joining us now, we have the Tank Archive himself, and the guy who wrote the book on the IS-2, Mr. Peter Samsonov. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the first thing I'd like to, clear the deck with is how did you come to be Mr. Tank Archives? Certainly, you're an invaluable resource for anyone who loves tanks on Twitter and Facebook.
It's quite a long story. I think it starts about 10 years ago in the World of Tanks forums. I'm sure some of your audience might remember the days when you had the debates raging about the stats of this tank or that. And Wargaming at the time was quite active on LiveJournal. Their researchers would be posting documents, basically everything that the actual stats of the tanks in World of Tanks was based on. And since I'm fluent in Russian and I wanted to win those internet arguments, I would translate them. And in those times, I don't know if it's changed since then, but the moderators would come in basically at any sign of disagreement or heated debate and just delete the entire thread and ban everyone. So
which is always a sound move, but yeah.
Oh yeah. In order to avoid having to type up the same thing over and over and over again, I had the idea, okay, why don't I just put it like off-site somewhere on a blog and link to it? And it turns out that I wasn't the only person linking to it. Lots of other people found what I was doing interesting and decided to use it in, their own internet arguments. And as the years went by, I think the historical forum of World of Tanks is long gone. I don't know about War Thunder or any other other models that are available. I'm sure there's no shortage of. Sometimes I see them in my referrals, like Steel Division or Company of Heroes, all of these game boards where people have to debate about tank stats. It's very useful to them. And since then, I would get referrals or citations from actual researchers. Like I think the first one in 2015 was Zaloga in Armored Champion, I think it was. Cited some of my works, and I guess that was the beginning of going legit. Once
the logo's citing you, you're really in and deep, aren't you?
Yeah. Shortly after that, I started writing my own articles. I wrote some magazine articles in the now defunct Armor Journal. I wrote articles for quite a few years for Warspot, which was Wargaming's military history spin-off. Both for the Russian version of the website and the English language version of the website, which is now sadly gone. And then a couple of podcasts here and there. I started my own YouTube channel. I was actually invited to write a book, my first book in 2000 and early 2019, I think it was. And I thought, I can't possibly write a book. It would be too hard. But then the publisher said, it's only going to be 22,000 words, I think their limit was. 20,000 words, 80 pictures. And I thought, that's more or less 10 articles. And I was putting out, I think, about an article every 3 or 4 weeks at that point. And I thought, well, if I just write books instead of articles, I can get a book out by the end of the year. And then it happened. And of course, before I finished writing my first book, I had an idea for my second and third and fourth and so on. So it never ends. And before I knew it, 10 years have gone by. Tank Archives is this, I guess, recognizable brand, if you want to call it that. I definitely did not expect this to happen 10 years ago when I just started out, but here we are.
You think part of the appeal for your writing is being able to translate from the original Russian tank doctrine books and being able to say you've got a niche in the market saying, look, this is what they actually wrote back in the 1930s and 40s about how to use their tanks and how to deploy them and so forth, rather than having to rely on translations that may or may not be accurate?
Yeah, that was a big part of it. So unfortunately, it takes a while. Just as, a tank comes out of a factory, it'll be 3 or 4 months before it gets to the front lines. If a document is made publicly available, it'll take years and years before it enters, common knowledge, before historians get their hands on it and can place it into proper context and analyze it. Because really the key is something, and this has happened to me many times, where I go across a document and it's just, okay, pointless, who cares? I don't, some report from some pointless brigade in the middle of nowhere saying, okay, they have 10 T-34s, fine, I don't care. Years later, I go, hold on, this brigade is actually somewhere very interesting, and the fact that they even have any T-34s at all is very important. It's all about context. And you need to find the people who would make use of these documents and connect them to these documents. And that's where I come in. Unfortunately, I'm only one person, and I can only do so much. But that's definitely this kind of speaking multiple languages is very useful. When I wrote articles for Wargaming, a lot of them were based on Canadian archives and British archives and American archives, because I would say more Russians speak English than English, or English speakers also speak Russian. But yes, that kind of ticket across the language barrier is very, very valuable. But it's only one cog in the machine of history.
What got you into enjoying tanks? I guess, was it just World of Tanks, or was there some other something before then?
I was interested in tanks before World of Tanks, but sort of on a background level. I grew up, so interestingly enough, most of my family is served in the Navy, not in the land forces. But I grew up in Moscow, where there's precious few naval bases. But every so often we go to some museum where there were, of course, row upon row upon row of tanks. And some of these museums you could, either during official events or because there wasn't really that much supervision in the 90s, you could climb into the tanks, you could climb on the tanks. I was actually inside a Tiger at the Lenino-Snigiri Museum in the 90s, when you could get away with that sort of thing. So I suppose that's where my love of tanks grew. And World of Tanks.
Sorry, Peter, can I ask, were you 10 years old when you started climbing on tanks?
Thereabouts.
It's a through line we're getting with a lot of our guests.
There's a very bad, very blurry Polaroid of me, I think, about that age and up of a Sherman. I have it somewhere. But this is definitely something that I was a fan of from a very early age.
Nice one. I mean, I'm constantly frustrated by the way that Soviets, or no, let's just say it's Russian, because the issue is Russians rather than Soviets. Russian equipment and technical prowess is constantly downgraded in the West, and I think it's part of the whole bringing the Nazis into the Western military-industrial complex in the 1950s. But yeah, and then just taking everything that the German generals said as gospel. But the sophistication, sophistication is the wrong word. The technical achievement of the T-34 is, American industry couldn't put a 76 millimeter cannon in a turret until 1943. How do you deal with that? Prejudice is probably the right word against all things Russian.
It's definitely a slow grind. I would say the kind of people who are interested in tank history on more than just a general level, they would be the ones reading Zaloga. They would be the ones reading. There's actually some pretty good translations of Russian authors available these days. Kavalerchik, Barazinsky, Pashaluk. A lot of my work is based on his work. If people actually care, they would be reading these books, and they don't really have these prejudices. A lot of the time, of course, someone read somewhere that, took 15 T-34s to defeat one Tiger, and they're just parroting that fact over and over. I would say that those people are just, trying to convince them is like screaming into the void. When I was younger and I had more spare time, 10, 15 years ago, I would try and convince them. Since then, I've decided that it's impossible to convince everyone, and unfortunately, some people will continue to believe these Cold War era myths, for their entire lives, and there's nothing I can do to change that.
Well, I mean, there's a bit you can do, and you do it. I mean, let's talk about your most recent book. Even as tank podcasters, which doesn't make us experts or historians, but we're certainly enthusiasts. We said, okay, let's do IS-2. We knew the tank existed, so we sat down to do the episode, and we started researching the tank. And 122 millimeter gun. Ferociously thick armor, very mobile, relatively light tank. If actual and also a huge track record of performance. This thing fought King Tigers and won. And yet almost unknown. Whereas the Tiger is still going up on teenage boys' bedroom walls to this day. So, I mean, I guess, you're the guy who wrote the book. Tell us a bit about your journey through the IS-2.
Sure. So the reason why I even wrote a book in the first place is because very little information is available on it. Bernard Cast, who is better known probably as Military History Visualized, he started this military history group, the publisher. So I don't know if we have video, but this is the cover of the book.
We'll put video on the YouTube version. Yep.
All right. Awesome. So Bernard Cost, he did a video on the IS-2. And we usually, whenever he uses any of my sources, he usually shoot me a link and kind of say, hey, can you look over this? And so I knew what he was doing, his IS-2 video, but he was actually disappointed generally with the amount of English language or German language sources available on the tank. And so, of course, what do you do when there aren't any good books out there? You write your own or get me to write it for you. So they published a couple of books through the military history group. I think this was the first third-party one that went out through that. But the idea was kind of the same thing that I was doing with my other books. Rather than just take what's conventional wisdom or these kind of entrenched myths and do another rehash of, here's like the technical specs of the T-34 or whatever. I started that book from the ground up, right? Here's primary documents and only primary documents. How did this tank come from just the very beginning? Absolutely nothing. And as a result, that book has information that you will not find anywhere else, because you have 50 books that essentially have the same content, and then you have this one that doesn't talk about combat, doesn't talk about all these on paper stats. I do mention them, of course, but it ended up being a very different book. And so Bernard wanted something very similar for IS-2, which is, again, designing the T-34 was all about the design and testing and the industrial aspect of it.
Driving it 1,000 miles up and down the road.
Yeah, that too. So this is development, design, and production. And that's all it is. There's no combat. We are going to put that in a different book, probably, hopefully. This is all about why did the Soviets need this tank in the first place? We had the KV. The KV in 1941 was pretty much what people imagined the Tiger was. Pretty much invincible to anything short of TOW-DA guns. Huge gun, can defeat any German Panzer III, Panzer IV, 2,000 meters. Tactical mobility leaves much to be desired. Strategic mobility leaves a lot to be desired, but
couldn't fit a bigger gun on it.
Yeah, and so I talk about, I think for the first little bit of the book, how do you go from that in December of 1941, and then in the summer of 1942, the Red Army goes, scrap everything. We need to start from the ground up. We need to build a new tank. Interesting journey. It's not described anywhere in any English language book that I've ever seen, even in Russian ones. They kind of skip over and just say, hey, 1944, there's IS-2s in the field now. Why? Don't worry about it. So that was one of the major motivations. As you said, the IS-2 hasn't really entered the public's imagination like the Tiger has, or even the T-34 has. a big part of it is because of how good it was. So the Soviets in 1940, even 1943, in late 1943, they decided that the 85 millimeter, so the 76 millimeter gun, in April, after doing trials against the Tiger, they figured out, okay, we can't build new tanks with this gun. We need to replace it with something else, an 85 millimeter. After the Battle of Kursk, they started having doubts about the 85 millimeter. So you couldn't really put anything bigger on a T-34, but the Su-85, the Su-100 was developed as a result. They wanted to put a 122 millimeter gun on the T-44. They put a 122 millimeter gun, of course, on the IS-1, and there was an attempt to put it in the KV-85. They built a prototype, but there was no point in evolving that platform any further since the IS-2 became available. And so this trend continued into after the war. So the 100 millimeter gun was okay. The 122 millimeter gun was still okay.
And why would you take 100 when you could take 122? Especially when
it doesn't fit.
It doesn't fit in. And you didn't have the resources for making the 100 mils.
Well, this is after the war, so you kind of have a little bit more freedom in terms of resources. But the trick is the 100 millimeter doesn't fit into a T-34 at all, and they tried. The 122 millimeter does not fit into a medium class chassis at all, and they tried. And so you have the IS-2. It's a mobile platform that the army is more or less satisfied with, and they made thousands of them. And so the tank remained in service, and they modernized it, and officially they were only written off in the 90s. So this is a vehicle's 50 years of service. Unfortunately, if the tank is still in service, that means it's classified, and so there aren't really, it can't really exist in popular consciousness. It's not like today where everyone knows about the Abrams or the T-14. There's probably more scale models made at the T-14 than the actual thing.
Far more models made of the T-14 than the real thing.
All right. Before this kind of mass media phenomenon, you couldn't really find a lot out about classified vehicles. Like, I have a scan of the IS-2 post-war manual, and it's just called heavy tank. It doesn't even say the name. That's how classified it is.
Well, is that because they're taking away the Joseph Stalin part of it and just saying, is that a bit of reclassification of doublespeak?
That was the late 40s. So Stalin was still alive. But yes, interesting aside, they switched from calling the IS-8, they switched it to T-10, I think even before Stalin died. So there's definitely this sort of political readiness when it came to the heavy tank designers. The medium tank designers just gave their tanks numbers and didn't care. So it seems to have worked anyway.
That's an interesting point you make, though, that the long service life of the vehicle led to more secrecy around it than, say, the German vehicles, which all exited service in 1945.
Yeah, and I don't think the Western militaries got their hands on an IS-2. They found like a gun, I think a D-25 in the rubble in Berlin, and I don't know if any were captured in Korea, but there was no availability of good information on it. And even with the T-34, there was one captured in Korea, and they had an opportunity to study it at Aberdeen, and the British had an opportunity to study it as well. But see how many Cold War era myths there are about this tank. So in order to establish good base of sources and a good base of information, you need to have not just one tank, but a lot of tanks. And you need to have the documents behind the tanks be publicly available. And of course, in the USSR, that's not going to be the case. So it's only in the 90s that this information came to light. And I have a couple of Soviet era, Glasnost era books on armor development, and there's barely anything. Like the IS-2 is, even in the book written by the staff of the Kirov factory who developed the IS-2, maybe 90% of the book is about how great the KV-1 is and how much the T-34 sucks. They definitely liked there's this big not invented here syndrome in Soviet weapons manufacturing, where tanks produced by your factory are great and perfect, and tanks produced by everyone else suck. That's not unique to the internet. But yeah, even this book that was extolling the virtues of the Kira factory's output gives very few specifics about the IS-2. And this was written in the 80s when, this was hardly top of the line model. The kind of political restrictions, censorship restrictions of the Soviet era were starting to slip, and even then, very little information was made public about the tank.
This is interesting because the Soviets sent a significant number of their tanks to the Americans and the British to try and encourage them to make better tanks to send back to the Soviets under Lend-Lease. Are you saying that the really good stuff they didn't send?
There was a big delay in terms of what they would send for study. So the tanks that sent to the UK, this was summer of 1943 that they were sent out. This was a T-34 with the small turrets, the low turrets, which was like 1942 design, really. And the KV-1, and they sent the KV-1, which wasn't even in production at the time. The KV-1S was in production, and then even that was being phased out in favor of the IS later that year. So the tanks that they were sending, they weren't the latest and greatest, and this wasn't because of any kind of machinations or sabotage or anything. It takes a while for these processes to complete. And then the British would only go to analyze the T-34 by like 1944. They ran some trials on these tanks, and this is the most they had to work with. But even in the British reports, I wrote an article on the T-34 in the UK, and I have these documents somewhere, but they're writing, we're seeing the tanks that we're seeing, that our attachés are seeing on the Eastern Front, they're not the kind that we have here. They're very different. So it's just, it takes a very long time. No IS-2s were sent. I don't even know if the British requested any. Because they started asking for T-34s since like November 1941, basically, as soon as they found out about them. And took a very long time to get permission for the tanks to actually be shipped. I can only imagine what they would say, if they say, "Hey, can you send us an IS-2 tank?" On the other hand, the Americans were happy to send a Pershing to the USSR in 1945. Although I don't know how much learnings came out of it, because they considered the tank, this is a tank with the mass of a heavy tank, but the armament and armor of a medium. What can you really do with it?
Fair enough. While we've got you, one thing that I'm nibbling at the edges of is the number of women in the Soviet tank corps in World War II, and I've seen people try and downplay it to being no more than the number who won the Order of the Red Star or were actually mentioned in dispatches, but it seems that number. I feel like that number's lowballed to literally only reflect the ones who won major medals. Do you have much data on that in the Russian sources?
Yes, I have an estimate. It's in the tens of thousands.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. There's like Maria Oktyabrskaya, who won the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, and you had Ekaterina Petliuk, celebrity tank driver, and you had the Boyko family, where the wife was a commander of an IS-2 and later of an ISU-122, and then the husband was the driver. But then you have, for each dashing officer who's up there commanding a tank, commanding a battalion, commanding a regiment, you have just thousands of people who come in to their equivalent of, a 9 to 5, right? And they're stacking papers in a headquarters somewhere, or they're refueling the tanks, they're bashing the track pins, swapping out radios. You're not going to read about these people. That's just, unless it's some kind of very specific, narrow study of one specific unit or what women were doing in the Red Army during the war. It's not terribly interesting to share award orders that say, this person did their job for 4 years and just never really excelled at. I mean, not even excelled, but never really stepped outside of it. There's an award order that I have that I found. I never bothered translating it because it's so boring. But it's interesting because it's so boring. Where this guy was an assistant tractor driver, and he started the war as an assistant tractor driver, and he ended the war as an assistant tractor driver. He never got promoted. He never got anything. They gave him the 4 Courage medal by the end, and the award order was just like, yeah, I don't know. This guy drove for 20,000 kilometers in his tractor. All right, and that's what most people in the army would be doing. They would be just doing their job day in and day out, and they don't really have Hollywood-worthy stories like these people that you read about.
Yeah, I mean, for everyone in a war who's in at the pointy end of a fighting regiment, there's many others who sit on an island with an anti-aircraft gun and never see anything fly over. So that's and as we get older, that seems like a more and more attractive option. When you're young, it's like, no, I want to be in the middle of the.
There was definitely, when you read about the Far East Front and the Transbaikal Front, when they were sitting across the border staring into the barrels of Japanese guns for 4 years, and they're raring to go. They're itching for some action. They're upgrading their BT-7s and their T-38s with scrap armor that they can get their hands on. And then May of 1945 hits, and all these people from Europe start arriving with their shiny new tanks, and those are the ones going into battle, and not them.
Yeah.
And there was a little bit of, they were a little bitter about that.
At the same time, they got to have grandchildren, so it's swings and roundabouts. Okay, Peter, thank you so much. I just want you to know I was at quite a good party last night, and a young woman asked me if I wanted any pingers, and I had to say no. I'm interviewing Peter Samsonov in 8 hours, so.
Did she know who I was?
No, no, she didn't, but I did.
I did get. I was at 2 reenactment events in June, July, and I did get people coming up to me and saying, "Hey, you're that tank guy." So some people know who I am.
Yeah, like if you're at a tank-related thing, the metric changes a bit. Nice one. Look, Peter, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your knowledge. Can you tell us where the best places to, tell our audience the best places to follow you?
Twitter, Facebook. I have an Instagram that I started very recently, so if you could follow me on that, that'll be great. YouTube as well. I think if you just search Tank Archives, they all come up. So whatever the social media platform of your choice. I even have a Mastodon, even though I don't really use it anymore.
It's getting very hard. Where the hell is this content going? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Peter. And hopefully we'll have cause to talk to you in the not too distant future.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Talk to you later then. Bye-bye.
And hello, folks.
We're back.
We're back.
Thank you very much from Peter from the Tank Archives for talking to us. We had a lovely time, even though it was a bit early for us on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
And talking about people who have YouTube channels / blogs and so forth about tanks. What's been happening? Oh, we're going to change the background.
I'm going to change the background. There we go.
There.
Oh, NAFO.
No, we're going to talk about
NAFO and Laserpig are intertwined.
All right, we'll go for that. So, for those who don't know, this week there's been ongoing discussion about the T14 Armata, which we covered a couple of months ago.
In fact, immediately after we did our T14 episode, was when Laserpig did his. And I do want to stress that everyone in Tank YouTubedom is in agreement. And this is what makes this fight so frustrating. We're all in agreement that the T14 is a fictional tank with a dodgy engine that is probably never going to see mainstream production light of day. So that's all points of agreement, but we are fond of hyperbole. And Laserpig...
We hyperbole on a hyperbole.
Yeah, Laserpig just went a little too far on some of his hyperbole. One was when he said, the British 120mm rifled gun is, superior for British reasons, and that's just garbage. Even the British know it's not. That's why they're moving away from it as fast as they can. And if you listen to our Challenger episodes, we do talk about their ammunition supply issues and contracts with Belgian companies that led to them sticking with a gun they didn't need.
Could you imagine having a 120mm rifled gun in Ukraine right now and saying, okay, so we've run out of 155 ammunition for our artillery, but now because we are using 1,000 rounds a day, if not more, and how many rounds of this 120 rifled ammunition can this Belgian company produce for us?
I don't think the Belgian company is even still in production.
10 basically, because nobody else is building this thing, your logistics train is just hopeless. Anyway,
that was a problem in that video. The big one, the big problem was saying that because the Tiger had a proposed engine for it with an X configuration on the pistons, and one of the engines...
It should have gone for a Y configuration like the Sentinel.
Yeah. One of the that was a clover lift, but anyway, one of the proposals for Armada was an X configuration. It was using a Tiger engine, and I've literally had one of my neighbours in my townhouse complex come up to me because he knows I do tank stuff and be like, "Oh, is it true that they were using the same engine in the Tiger?" And it's just like,
it's the same engine that was in the Panther.
Yeah. It's the X configuration one. And the answer is just because, every engine that's a V-shaped engine is not the same engine. That's probably the biggest point to point out. Or, a radial engine. All radial engines are not the same engine, even though they're radial engines. This little fight's been going on with Laserpig, and he's been doing huffy videos. And then
so we had similar sort of discussions on the YouTube-ness with the Arjun, which we did a while ago. But so this is just the latest iteration. So I think the tank YouTube community has to go through at least one of these a year.
Yeah, well, we get a lot of clicks from fighting with each other. So there's that.
But this week, the chieftains weighed in, saying basically people were asking him about it, and he's come up with a very reasoned response to it all, saying it's all speculation. But we don't know because nobody's actually been in one. Even though, as I said at the time, one of the videos with the T4 about the T14 Armada did have the chieftain sitting inside a tank. I'm saying, hang on a second, that's the chieftain. That's not a T14 Armada.
I just want to say from the outset, before anyone gets confused, I like Laserpig. I think he's done a lot of really cool things. I think he's been wrong on a couple of things, and that's fine.
We're wrong on a lot of things.
Well, we speak for 2 hours extemporaneously. We get things wrong, and we appreciate it.
Part of our charm.
Yeah, well, weird thing is, Laserpig did this whole little rant video being like, well, if I'm wrong, just say I'm wrong. So, well, just say you're wrong now then. No.
We got no ego involved in this, so we're quite happy to say when we're wrong.
Yeah, but as the chieftain says, there is it's nothing but speculation linking the Tiger engine to the T14 engine.
Now, what
speculation's fun, but frame it as speculation.
Yeah. One thing I will have to say to the chieftain, he invites Laserpig to sit down, talk tanks over shots of whiskey, and I say to myself, hang on a second.
Come on, Nicholas!
We've got plenty for me of drinking alcohol and talking tanks. We'd love to do that sort of stuff.
All the hard drinking tank people in this community.
So, welcome to Alexander Hodge. Thank you for joining us. And it was messy that we were looking at before. Anyway, we'll go on to the next. What more do we want to say about Laserpig?
Let's talk about NAFO.
NAFO, oh yes.
Which Laserpig does sell T-shirts on the NAFO.
North Atlantic Fellas Association.
Organisation.
Yeah.
And
I was wrong.
Yeah. Easy. See how easy it is. NAFO has become unbelievably high profile simply because they literally held a conference before the NATO conference in Vilnius, and the Lithuanian foreign minister turned up and told them how awesome they were.
So they're an organisation that likes to troll the Russians, basically, in order to support Ukraine.
Organisation's possibly a little strong.
Online troll collective. Mm-hmm. So they like to troll things. Oh, bias video. Welcome.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll keep moving. Sorry about the buffering. We do apologise for that. Yeah. So
technical issues will continue.
NAFO. Now, here's the thing. I've been part of internet lynch mobs, and I've started a few in my time, and they're fun.
Burn them down.
It's great fun. But at some point, you have to stand back and say, what am I doing? What is everyone else here doing? What are we achieving? And there are issues with NAFO and who benefits from it and who does it. And there are Australian retired major generals doing NATO flag waving, and people who should know better. And Adam Kinzinger, the former Republican congressman who does podcasts with the former Australian Prime Minister, is like one of its leading flag wavers. Fundamentally, it is funding the Georgian Legion, which is a cosplay group of a Nazi formation in World War II, who are using their funding to pay for people with plate carriers with Sonnenrads on them.
To go fight in Ukraine.
Now,
we've spoken before about...
there is a Nazi problem in Ukraine.
Yeah, there is. And that's one of the reasons why the Russians gone in there. But that's not...
The Russians use that as an excuse.
That is an excuse.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that everyone who supports Ukraine, and I desperately want Ukraine to get a good outcome from this war, so please do not think that I do not hold that view. What really saddens me is this idea that we only have two choices in all of this life, which is the horrible oligarchy of Vladimir Putin's regime in Russia, or a fascist oligarchy backing Ukraine. And if you have honestly had your life choices narrowed down to that being the only options available to you, you need to step outside and go meet some people and go to a trivia night at your local pub. Because there is so much more.
Where was Battle of York fought, John?
That was Canada.
That's the one, boys and girls. That's what he won the money for.
Yes, trivia night at the local pub. That's just one option. But you folks, you're you know a lot of history. So if you're being tempted to join an online fascist lynch mob, I would just say, hey, go to your local pub. Trivia night is a better option for how you utilize your time and energy.
That's been getting out of the house.
Yeah. No, that's good. Getting out of the house is good because we have better options available to us than these two things. So that's what I really want to say about this. Having said that, NAFO, it looks fun, and I've kind of gone along with bits of it. I'm not saying I'm beyond that, but our audience is much smaller, and that's fine. We don't actually. Yeah. We'd like a bigger audience, but we don't care.
I'm more here to be able to talk about tanks, drink beer, and hang out with John than I am to increase the audience to massive numbers and be able to quit my day job and do anything. No, I don't need that. I've got quite a good day job. I'm quite happy with it.
Yeah. So that's all I'm saying is, and I'm sure there are some of our listeners who have been tempted by NAPO. Seems like fun, and do a bit of it if you want to. It can be fun, but I would just say be a little bit careful of who's backing it and what they want and what you're going to give up to it, and don't give away any more than you can afford, I guess would be what I'd say. But it's disappointing that Laserpig is backing it the way he is, given its very strong links to Nazi symbology, particularly given that he's one of the best advocates on the internet against the Verabus. So, Laserpig, I dipped my lid. Your recent video debunking the Michael Whitman myth was amazing, and I would
very enjoyable.
Strongly recommend anyone to go watch that. He's done a lot of good stuff. But have a look at the company you're keeping would be my advice. And if you want to do a video where we drink whiskey and talk about tanks with the chieftain, we're up for it. So
the time frames are going to be fun though.
Time zones.
Yeah, time zones. So we had the UK, Texas, and Canberra. That's going to be.
For a long time, I thought Laserpig was actually just the chieftain on a bunch of drugs. But, he's I'm wrong. or the chieftain's multiple personality disorders getting out of hand.
I mean, anyway, redbacks.
Yes.
Redbacks. Australia has made the choice. We've finally made the choice as to what infantry fighting vehicle we're going to go for between the Korean redback and the German Lynx. Lynx, and we've gone the Korean redback.
Yeah. Now we should note that the most consumed piece of content that we have ever made was our interview with Dr. Albert Palazzo on the Australian infantry fighting vehicle contract. By a huge margin. It's got something nearly 8,000 views compared to our most listened to episodes are about 4,000.
We should really make more of an effort to actually talk to the people at ADFA that do this sort of stuff, because it is part of their
Well, also because we can say to them, hey, because for Al, it's the most viewed thing that he's done. So the synergy is strong.
And being an alumni, I probably could bloody spin that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'll leave you to set up the interview. That would be awesome if you can set up some interviews.
You do all the work. I just come along and talk and drink beer.
Yeah. Let's talk more about that. Okay.
John does all the work. He's great at it. Yeah. And you should listen to his Radio War Nerd interview from yesterday as well, talking about tanks in Ukraine.
Yeah,
and
let's talk about Ukraine.
Yeah.
Because it's been 6 weeks, and the offensive had kind of started fully in the last episode, and it's been 6 weeks, and things have not gone well.
No, they haven't progressed. They haven't gone badly, but they have not progressed.
Well, to the extent that thousands of young Ukrainians have blown their legs off in minefields and achieved fuck all. Excuse my language.
Well, I mean, I haven't seen the mass numbers of troops going through. It's all, to my mind, from what I've seen, it's all been small unit actions so far. And again, they're still probing and trying to find a break in the defensive lines in order to be able to break through and then exploit.
Yeah, let's talk about the danger of probing, though. Probing is essential if you don't know where the weak spot is. The danger in probing, though, and it's enormous, is the enemy might let you see a weak spot. The enemy is watching your movements, and they say, oh, here, come through here, that we're weak here. And what you're actually doing is advancing into a box canyon with artillery surrounding it, and
Balaclava is nearby.
Yeah, landmines. Landmines all laid with sophisticated timers in them, and as you rush all your available forces into what you think is your exploit of the weak spot, you get blown to pieces. And this has been a strong tactic since at least the Battle of Cannae, although quite possibly before that. Some talking
2,000 years ago.
Yeah, 2,000 years ago. It was part of Russian doctrine in 1945. It was the NATO plan in the event that the Cold War went hot and filled a gap. This is how you do it. You give them a moment where their probe breaks through, and you let them all come through, and they're entering a killing ground. You don't need to be a military genius to think of this. This is well known, and it's just how you do it. So the Ukrainians are very vulnerable now that they're trying to probe everywhere to the Russians doing really nasty stuff to them. But my bigger problem with all of this is that the Western arms manufacturers are now taking an enormous amount of Ukrainian money, taking an enormous amount of taxpayers' money from their own countries, funneling all the substandard, out-of-date gear to Ukraine, making them advance over minefields.
The thing is, they pulled out of Afghanistan. How are they going to maintain sales if they don't maintain this conflict?
Yeah, well, that's the problem. And, you get to Google Eisenhower's Cross of Iron speech. I would strongly recommend anyone who's never read it, because there's someone who no one can accuse of being a left-wing peacenik. He's a Republican president of the United States and former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. And he's saying, for every dollar we are spending on weapons, we are robbing our future. And Ukraine is not even their future. We're robbing... You poor Ukrainians are having to advance over minefields, and literally in the last week there was a story in the Warzone where the headline was Ukrainians have realised that advancing over minefields in the face of hostile artillery is a bad tactic, and it's like, well, I'm glad they had to kill so many of their own people to get to that conclusion. And as I was talking about in the Warnerd, they were saying, oh, what's the NATO way of dealing with minefields? And I said, well, it's not just the NATO way, it's the smart ways. You go around them. And if you can't go around them, you come up with all other ways. And the biggest way is you have complete air superiority and you suppress their artillery parks and you give your engineers time to progress slowly through.
Realistically, with your H. Norman Schwarzkopf statement about going around the minefields in Iraq.
Yeah.
So the Ukrainians
invented a whole new way to lay pipelines to do that.
Realistically, the Ukrainians should build up their forces on the Russian border, go through Kursk, and sweep round into the Donbass area from that, because that probably doesn't have a whole lot of minefields in that. So basically,
I don't think the Russians are laying a lot of minefields in Russian territory.
Yeah,
you're right about that.
Yeah, so swing through Belgium and take out, avoid the fortifications of the Ardennes and the Maginot Line, and go swing through Russia and go down, which. Would actually be a very effective tactic.
Yeah, but we would see nukes rain down on Kiev.
Yeah, that would be bad. I mean,
possibly Warsaw, possibly London.
Yeah. So, and I don't think me rugby would go very well with that.
But this comes down to the.
But it is when thinking outside the box and saying, well, okay, this is an insurmountable problem here, but we could just go around it.
Yeah.
So that's where it ends up.
Yeah. Fundamentally, no smart army does frontal assaults over minefields covered by artillery.
No, tell General Haig that.
He did that less than you think. and what did they learn from that? They learned not to do it. That's the outcome.
The 15th time when they got it. So it's General Melchett. Anyway, but you should pour your next beer, John, because we need to talk about our new German beer, the Brewdog King Kolsch Pro. Brewdog.
So Brewdog is a problematic but very popular brewery. They're from Scotland originally. They make very good beer. I do not question that.
Brewed in Cologne.
Oh, they brewed a Kolsch in Cologne. Okay. Oh, well done for them.
Yeah.
So the Kolsch yeast comes from Cologne and is a real competitor with lager. It's less popular, but most people should give it a try because it can be just as good, if not better, than lager. And look, it's very clear. It's delightful on the nose. Probably slightly stronger on the nose than a lager would be.
It's very stronger on the taste buds than a lager.
I've made some delightful Kolsch's in my own beer brewing. They do require a low temperature. Not as low as lager, weirdly, but low temperature brewing is still a lot of faffing around compared to just letting it roll at the ambient room temperature. I guess I better take a sip. Okay.
It's got a stronger flavour than the others we've had today.
Well, you didn't drink that blonde beer.
Oh, sorry, no, I didn't.
It's very similar to that blonde beer, actually.
All right, there you go. It's a 5.2%. It's 330ml can. Mm-hmm. There you go. Brewdog King Kolsch. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's quite nice. It's So it's slightly.
Brewdog make good beer. They had a social responsibility.
What? Anybody know what Fröder means? No.
Anyway, they were signed up to a social responsibility metric, which was good, but then they crashed out of it because they couldn't treat their staff decently, which is bad. I don't believe they're inherently much worse than a lot of other places, and one of their big things is getting people to sign up for crowdfunding rounds, and so they've got a lot of beer fan shareholders who are... It's not a great shareholder deal to be part of these rounds, but if you're a regular at the pub, then you can get some value from it. Anyway, this beer is good.
Good.
Glad. As I would expect from Brewdog, who do make good beer.
I had a number of weeks of figuring out and just wandering past, I'll grab, that's German beer, I'm going to grab that. So that's why we have a number of different choices today. So we'll figure out what happens next time. But Is there anything else we want to cover off on, John?
Quite a lot. So just going back to the redback deal, there's a few things going on here. I think one of them is that the Rheinmetall plant in Queensland is now exporting boxes to Germany.
That's exciting.
Quite exciting, but I think it just means their capacity is more constrained than it had been. And given that every expert has said the redback and the links were just comparatively tied on how good they were.
But it doesn't hurt that the redback is going to be built in the
Defence Minister's electorate.
The Defence Minister's electorate, even though he
recused himself.
He did actually make the effort, but yeah, gotta say there is a bit of looking after your own patch there.
Possibly, but I'm willing to say that given that the Rheinmetall plant in Brisbane is really ramping up to do boxer production, it makes quite a lot of strategic sense for Australia to stand up another facility to make IFVs.
That's a good point. We're making the and commonality with the Huntsman, K9 Huntsman. Yeah. So it means that we've got...
They're different vehicles, but
they are different.
Producer.
And same engine, though. There's a lot of commonalities between the two vehicles. So once you train up your mechanics to, say, work on this engine, they can transfer across that knowledge and be able to work on the between the redback and the Huntsman. So, and not to mention, come on, Australian Spiders, coolest in the world.
Yeah, but I would say for a country with a very limited manufacturing base, that the last time I went to war seriously, literally had to pull lathes out of
the dumps,
buried in dumps. Having two different facilities making high-tech fighting gear
just remember, John, once the production run is finished, and if there is no further purchase going on, those plants are going to be shut down. Everything's going to be stripped out of them and sold off. And so, while we say that now, 6 years from now, once the production run is finished, if there is no further work going, those places are going to be empty and we'll have no capacity to be able to do those things again.
This is part of strategic manufacturing policy, but we're not very good at it as a country because we hate unions.
Yeah, and the government just doesn't want to think of saying, well, I'm in power now, so I'll do things that help me while I'm in power now, rather than think about things that's going to happen in 10 years' time because I may not be in power, so who cares?
Now, the most important part of the show, we've left it far too late, now that we're here well out over the 2-hour mark. We are not going to Oz Armour Fest this year.
No.
And we're sorry, we know a lot of people are going, we're like, I'm going to hang out with you, have some beers, and we're like, next year, guys.
Maybe next year. In fact, probably not next year because there are certain other things happening in October next year that I might be involved with. Yes.
The Armour Fest is in August.
I know. I think it's going to be hard. Anyway,
I think I can put in so much work for your missus that we can get by you 72 hours of leave.
I'm not sure about that. Anyway, but it's happening.
We are not going to Oz Armour Fest this year, so we are sorry about that, guys. And the women too. We're sorry about that, folks. But coming up in Canberra for the first time in many years is the Australian War Memorial's Big Things in Store Day on 2nd of September.
Unfortunately, I will not be there.
You will not be there. I will be going with Cornelius.
Good friend to this podcast.
And we will I will be making a video out of what's in there. So basically, what people don't realise is...
V1 rockets.
Yeah, V2 rockets.
V2 rockets, sorry. Yep.
Also V1s. But yeah, if you imagine the
ME-109s.
The warehouse at the end of the first Indiana Jones movie where they store the Ark of the Covenant, this is the Australian equivalent, and it opens up very rarely. Yeah. 2nd September it's opening up.
I remember when I went through in 2001, and it was freaking awesome.
Yeah. But, so here's the thing, you do need to book. You go to awm.gov.au. There'll be links you can find from there. So you're looking for Big Things in Store, and you book a free ticket. Okay, it's free. It gets you 2 hours walking through the warehouse, and everyone who comes to Canberra for that, we will meet you at the pub at 6 p.m. that day, and we'll have some beers and talk about tanks. So that's what we're doing this year instead of Oz Armour Fest. And we'll figure out what's going on with Oz Armour Fest 2024 later.
But we'll probably go. Look, the plan at the moment is we'll probably go down to East Gippsland Tank Adventures in April, May next year.
We haven't spoken to the Gippsland Tank Adventures on that, so
Or the Pacopanel Tank Museum,
which is supposed to be happening. Yeah,
at the end of next year, but we might see if we can sneak in and get somebody to take us around, especially.
I'll let you call in your contacts for that.
Well, I have no contacts, but I'm just making the effort. So as we drive down to Victoria, see some friends, and drive to, and jump in some tanks, I think that's probably a go for us. But yeah, we'll see what happens next year.
We will. Okay, so I think this has been a very long one, and we really want to make enormous thanks to everyone who has the poll. Oh, you want to talk about the poll? Okay. Yes. So the options were the best tank of World War II for the Panther, a disastrous failure, or good in parts. Now, given that Rob tried to make the argument that the Panther cost Germany the whole of World War II, no one has gone with disastrous failure, Rob.
But I also said it was the best tank of World War II, so I feel vindicated in my statement.
Right. Okay. Yes. So the results have come back. Best tank of World War II, 17%. Good in parts, 83%. And I apologise in that I created a poll with an option that was just so obvious to go for. But that's pretty much where we all end up and come back to. So it's fantastic. Thank you for everyone who's stuck with us through this.
It's been lovely.
We've had a lot of fun, and 2nd of September, we're not going to try and organise a group totally tanked run through the facility, but like I said, we will organise a pub meetup that evening afterwards, so everyone can talk about their favourite thing that they saw in the archive. And on that note,
thank you very much. We're totally tanked, and we talk about tanks.